In this video I will name the most infamous tornado in every state except for Alaska and Hawaii because they have only had weak tornadoes. Starting with Alabama, and this one is going to of course be the 2011 Tuscaloosa-Birmingham EF4. This tornado had 64 fatalities. As also, honorable mentions for this spot are the Hackleburg-Phil Campbell EF5 and the Gwynn F5. Next is going to be Arizona because we are skipping Alaska because of the small amount of tornadoes the state has had in their history. Anyways, the most known tornado from Arizona's history is the 1972 Phoenix F2 that had 3 injuries. An honorable mention for this spot is the 1964 Tucson F2. Arkansas is next, as with not much competition the most infamous tornado in the state's history is the 2023 Little Rock EF3. Although it only happened last year, it was all over the headlines, being one of the worst tornadoes from the March 31, 2023 outbreak. Some honorable mentions are the Texarkana and Warren tornadoes. California's most famous tornado is the 1983 LAF2, as an honorable mention is the Long Beach F2. Colorado's most famous tornado is pretty obvious, as it is the 2016 Ray, Colorado EF2, which may seem like a normal tornado, but it was actually known for some amazing footage taken by Reed Timmer, as his video about the twister got over 100 million views. An honorable mention is the Campo EF2 tornado. The most infamous Connecticut tornado is the 1878 Wallingford F4 that had 34 fatalities. An honorable mention are the New Haven and Springfield tornadoes. The most infamous tornado in Delaware history occurred last year and was rated EF3. An honorable mention is the 1944 Cambridge F3. The most famous Florida tornado is actually also the deadliest tornado in the state's history, as it's the 1998 Kissimmee F3 that killed 25 people. An honorable mention is the 1966 Lakeland Tampa Largo F4. The most known Georgia tornado is easily the 1936 Gainesville F4, also being the deadliest tornado in the state's history, killing 203 people. It also had the most deaths in a single building from a tornado after a fire ignited in the Cooper Pants factory, as 70 people died. The 1940 Gooding F3 is probably the most famous tornado in Idaho history, although there have not been many notable tornadoes in the state's history. I'm going to count the 1925 Tri-State F5 for Illinois, as most of the tornado's path was in Illinois and most of the deaths occurred in the state. The 1974 super outbreak caused many large tornadoes to hit Indiana, including, in my opinion, the most famous tornado in the state's history being the 1974 DuPont Daisy Hill F5. An honorable mention is the Hanover-Madison F4 from the same outbreak. Iowa's most famous tornado is last year's Keota, Iowa EF4 from the March 31, 2023 outbreak. Honorable mentions are the 1976 Jordan F5 and the 2008 Parkersburg EF5. The most famous tornado in Kansas history is the 2007 Greensburg, Kansas EF5 that had 11 fatalities. Kentucky's most famous tornado is the Mayfield EF4 from 2021 that had 58 fatalities. Next is Louisiana, as the most famous tornado in the state's history is easily the 1840 Great Natchez F4 that killed 317 people, making it the second deadliest tornado in U.S. history. Not many tornadoes have touched down in Maine, but the most famous tornado in the state's history is probably the 1954 Caribou F2 that killed 1 person. The most famous tornado in Maryland history is easily the La Plata F4 that had 3 fatalities and was arguably F5 strength. Massachusetts's most infamous tornado is the tragic June 9, 1953 Worcester F4 tornado that killed 94 people. This tornado was rated F5 originally but was downgraded over 20 years later. The deadliest tornado in Michigan history is also the most known, as it's the Flint Beecher F5 that had 116 deaths. The Rochester F5 is the most infamous tornado in Minnesota history. This tornado had one of the craziest stories and was maybe the most important tornado of all time. This is because a makeshift hospital was created after the tornado, which ended up being the Mayo Clinic, one of the best hospitals in the entire nation. This tornado saved thousands of people, although it sadly killed 37. The most known tornado in Mississippi history occurred only 1 year ago after a massive Wedge EF4 tornado destroyed Rolling Fork, Mississippi, killing 17 people. This was the deadliest tornado of the entire year of 2023. Maybe the most infamous tornado of all time happened in Missouri, as it is the famous Joplin EF5 that had the most deaths of any tornado since 1947, when a massive F5 tornado killed 181 people in Woodward, Oklahoma. The Joplin EF5 was basically a worst-case scenario of any tornado, as it hit a very populated area as a multi-vortex rain-wrapped wedge. It was a terrible situation and killed 158 people. The most famous tornado in Montana history occurred in the rural fields of southeastern Montana in 2014. This tornado had no fatalities or injuries but killed 2 horses and is the most recent EF3 to hit Montana. The 2014 EF4 Pilger twins are the 2 most infamous tornadoes in Nebraska history, but I can only choose one tornado for this spot, so I will pick the first tornado to form that actually directly hit the town of Pilger and killed 1 person. Some honorable mentions are the second Pilger EF4, Wakefield EF4 and Omaha F4, which was actually the deadliest in the state's history, having 103 deaths. There have been almost no tornadoes in Nevada's history, but there has been one F2 that hit Reno, Nevada. The Thornton F3 tornado is the most famous in New Hampshire history, which is one of 3 F3s that have hit the state. The most famous tornado in New Jersey's history is the 1896 F3 that went south of the capital of the state, Trenton. This tornado had 4 deaths. The 2007 Clovis EF2 tornado is the most famous in the state of New Mexico's history, as it killed 2 people and injured 33. Very many photos and videos were taken of this EF2. The Brooklyn EF2 is the most famous tornado in New York history, mostly because it hit a very populated area. An honorable mention is the 1989 Coldenham F1 that killed 9 people, making it the deadliest tornado in New York history. The most infamous tornado in North Carolina history is the 1984 Greenville F4 that had 16 deaths and was part of a large tornado outbreak that affected North Carolina. The infamous Fargo F5 is easily the most known tornado in North Dakota's history. This tornado had 10 deaths and was one of the most highly photographed in the early stages of tornado photography. The infamous Xenia, Ohio F5 from the 1974 super outbreak that had 36 deaths, making it the deadliest of the outbreak. Another big tornado state is Oklahoma. The most famous tornado in the state's history is the 1999 Bridge Creek Moore F5 that killed 36 people. Honorable mentions are the El Reno EF3 and the Newcastle Moore EF5. For Oregon, I will not be counting the 1972 Vancouver, Washington, Portland, Oregon F3, as the tornado had most of its path in Washington, so the most famous tornado in Oregon history is the 2010 Salem, Oregon EF2. The 1985 Niles Wheatland F5 that killed 18 people is the most famous tornado in Pennsylvania history and is also the only F5 to hit the state. The 2023 Johnston EF2 is the most famous tornado in Rhode Island history, as this EF2 injured 1 person and is tied as the strongest tornado in the state's history. In 2020, the most infamous tornado in South Carolina history hit Estill. It killed 5 people and had 175-mile-per-hour winds. The most infamous tornado in South Dakota history is the 1998 Spencer, South Dakota F4 that had 6 deaths. The tragic Nashville, Tennessee EF3 is Tennessee's most famous tornado in their history. The infamous Jarrell, Texas F5 is the most famous tornado in Texas history. An honorable mention is the Waco, Texas F5. The Salt Lake City F2 is the most infamous tornado in Utah history, as it also killed 1 person. A short track F3 injured 1 person near Jamaica, Vermont, which is probably the most famous tornado in Vermont's history. The Petersburg F4 is the most infamous tornado in Virginia history, mostly because it is tied for the strongest. An honorable mention is the 2001 Jeffersonton F4. The Vancouver, Washington, Portland, Oregon is easily the most infamous tornado in Washington history, doing extensive damage throughout the two states. The 1944 Shinston, West Virginia F4, that is also the deadliest tornado in the state's history, is the most infamous tornado in the state's history. The tragic New Richmond F5, which is also the deadliest tornado in the state's history, killing 117 people, is by far the most infamous. Lastly is Wyoming. Wyoming's only F4 was a very weird tornado. This is because it occurred in Yellowstone National Park as a violent wedge and went over some insane elevation. That is all 50 US states' most infamous tornadoes, so if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe.